What's going on, guys? So today's video is going to be a bit controversial because I'm going to try to pull the curtain back a little bit and explain to you why RVs have such different prices at different dealerships. Why, if you go to one dealership and you look at a specific model, it may be a certain price. Generally, it'll carry the same MSRP as another dealership, but it might be 12 grand, 15 grand, 20 grand more than what another dealership might be selling that unit for. So sometimes people want to travel outside of their hometown to buy an RV because they save so much money. Financially, it just makes sense, and I can't blame you. But I'm going to try to explain why that happens, and also if I agree with it or not, because I think that's also important. So hang tight, you're not going to want to miss this video. All right, guys, so I've picked a nice location. Now let's get down to the meat and potatoes of this. So why is it that if you were shopping for an RV and you go to one dealership, that dealership may have this huge discount off of the MSRP versus another dealership which might only discount it, 10%? Why is one dealership so aggressive with their pricing and another dealership not so aggressive? Is the service after the sale really worth not taking advantage of $10,000 or $15,000 worth of difference, or even more in some cases, whenever you're buying an RV? I personally don't think so, and I don't think you would ever convince me that buying an RV at one dealership and paying $15,000 to $20,000 more for that unit is an excuse for better service. If you can justify that dealership will provide me $15,000 to $20,000 additionally above warranted repairs in terms of pure service, then feel free. Put it in the comments below. Explain to me why I should pay $15,000 to $20,000 more at one dealership just to get a better dealership experience. That to me makes no sense. So it's not that. What it comes down to ultimately is what a dealership can afford to sell units for. One, what they feel their margins need to be on those units. Two, what their operational costs are to keep their dealership open. Three, and probably more important to the dealership than anything, is how much do they feel they can get out of a specific RV. So breaking that down a little further, it's basically like saying if I have an RV that has an MSRP of $100,000 and I can get someone to pay $95,000 or $100,000 for that RV, why not? If I can make that much more money, that's more profit, that's more margin, that lets me run my business better, that lets me pay my employees better, it lets me put more money in my own pocket. Shoot, it's the American dream to own a small business and earn a profit and become successful, right? Well, I don't necessarily agree when it comes to this type of industry, and let me explain why. Let's say that an RV manufacturer, the people who actually build it, primarily in Elkhart and a few other places around the country, build an RV that costs them $45,000, right? It's a $45,000 manufacturing cost, and that accounts for everything: people, the warehouse, the parts, the supplies, the contracts that they have in place they have to follow. Everything that a manufacturer has to do to build an RV is going to cost that RV manufacturer $45,000. Now, let's say that they sell that unit for $50,000 to a dealership. Now, because they sell tons of RVs to tons of dealerships, they don't have to have the biggest margin ever. So let's just say they sell a $45,000 RV to a dealership for $50,000. So now let's say you have two different types of dealerships that are buying that RV. You have one that's this big national chain, or basically a very large chain of dealerships that's buying this RV, and they're paying 50 grand for it. And then you have a smaller RV dealership that doesn't quite do the volume, also paying $50,000 for it. Typically, the larger one might actually get it a little bit less because they're committing to buying so many more units at once. If I'm going to go to a store that you own and I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to buy 100 bottles of Coke from you, and I'd like to get an extra 10% off if I commit to buying 100 of these right now, basically ensuring that you're making that money, versus another dealership that says I can only commit to buying, 2 units from you at any given time. Of course, the volume purchase is going to equate to a better deal. and possibly more included options, simply because you're essentially guaranteeing that that manufacturer is staying in business, it's staying afloat. You're promising that you're going to buy a lot more units from them. Let's just say that the small dealership pays the same amount from the manufacturer, $50,000 for that RV. Now they get it on their lot. The RV manufacturer tells them that it has a $100,000 MSRP. Basically, they could sell this in a retail environment for $100,000. Probably understanding that they're not going to be able to really sell it for $100,000 unless you get the right customer to come in that just really doesn't do any shopping around, and they're really easy to sell on the features of the RV, and you make it look like it's worth $100,000 to them versus shopping around and seeing who else is selling it for less. But anyways, now both dealerships have this unit that they just paid 50 grand for. The manufacturer is saying it's a $100,000 value, and you now have a $50,000 margin, basically between the $50,000 they paid for it and $100,000 that the manufacturer says it's worth. So now the dealership says, well, I need to stay in business as well, right? I got to make a profit. I have to pay my employees. I have to keep the lights on, all the utilities, the marketing, the inventory tax, the Social Security tax, everything it takes to run a business has to be added onto that $50,000 cost, because that's more money that they have to pay just to stay open and to pay their people. And of course, hire good people, hire people that you can pay a fair amount to keep them from just wanting to jump to the next job. And let's say that that cost for both dealerships is the same, even though of course a bigger dealership's going to have more cost to stay open, but they're also going to sell more. So let's just assume it's apples to apples, and that cost is an additional $5,000. It's $5,000 just to keep the doors open to sell that RV. So now you have a $50,000 unit, that's $55,000 to each one of them. So now you have a $45,000 margin left. So now we need to talk about profit, right? Commission for the sales rep, commission for the business, the amount that the owner wants to make at the end of the day, all of that. So let's say that that accounts for another $5,000 to $10,000. Of course, a dealership who pays their reps a higher commission is going to get better talent, and that better talent might be able to sell more RVs. So let's just say that commission between the sales rep and the leadership and all the people in between that get paid is $5,000 to $10,000 depending on the dealership. So now we're talking about $60,000 to $65,000 all in on this RV that originally cost them $50,000. So now you have a $35,000 margin to play with. With that $35,000 margin is where you see the price difference come in between different manufacturers. Some manufacturers sell such high volume that they'll take an MSRP and they'll discount it significantly. Anywhere between 20 and 33% is typically where you're going to see a discount. And that discount is usually going to be there to give you as a buyer incentive to buy from that dealership, to make it look like you're getting this screaming outrageously good deal, while at the same time giving additional margin to the dealership. If a dealership is selling a identical unit as another dealership, but they're only discounting 5 or 10% off of the price, the rest of that is profit. It's on top of all the other operating costs they have. Now, of course, this doesn't hold true for every single brand out there. Some brands do not offer the same type of discounts. Some brands definitely have an asking price or a sales price that's much closer to the MSRP, and there's not really any room in there for negotiation. But for 85 to 90% of the RVs that are sold, there is a huge margin, and it's usually about 40% that the dealership has to play with that is actual profit. If they can sell you a unit anywhere under 30% off, then they're making additional profit on top of the profit that they would be making if they sold it for that 30 to 33%. Now, a dealership that does not sell a lot of units, basically a low volume dealership, might not be able to discount their units like a larger volume dealership. That's why these wholesale dealerships and these regional dealerships and these national chains tend to show you a much lower price right off the bat, whereas your smaller local dealerships may not be able to do that, because they do want to try to get as much possible profit out of the deal as possible, because it ensures that they keep their doors open longer. Now, this is where I get frustrated. This is what frustrates me about the process. I understand why they do it, but what I don't like about this process is it can put the buyer in a really bad situation. Let me give you an example. If I'm shopping for a fifth wheel and you're shopping for a fifth wheel and you don't know all this, so you go to a dealership and the dealership says, you know what, I'm going to take a couple grand off the price because you are you and I want to get you the best price possible. And you're like, wow, that's a sweet deal. This is a $100,000 unit. You're selling it to me for $95,000. And you decide to finance it for 12 years. Well, if you finance that for 12 years, you're going to have a relatively high payment for a very long period of time on an RV that's going to depreciate very quickly. Now, let's say I go into that exact same dealership or another dealership and I negotiate really well and I'm able to talk that $100,000 unit down to $65,000, or I'm able to talk it down to $70,000. And I decide to finance it for a shorter period of time. Not only is my payment going to be less, but the depreciation, which I'm still going to get, I'm still going to have a big hit in terms of depreciation. It's not going to be anywhere near the depreciation on a unit that somebody paid $25,000 more for, being the identical unit, if you follow what I'm saying. So if I paid 70 grand and you paid $95,000, you're still going to get a depreciation off of it. I'm still going to get a depreciation off of it. My depreciation is going to be off 70 grand. Your depreciation is going to be off 95 grand. But look at it this way. The value of that unit to a buyer, to a dealer, if you go to sell it or trade it in, is going to be identical for both. So if I take my $70,000 unit and try to sell it a year later and somebody tells me, I can only give you 50 grand for it. Well, the person who paid $95,000 is only going to get 50 grand for their unit as well. They're going to be stuck with a unit that they can't get out of. They're so far upside down on it, it's impossible to get out of. And that does frustrate the heck out of me. And I don't care what any dealership says about the service that they provide after the sale. I'm sorry, but they don't provide an additional $25,000 service to a buyer. If I'm buying a unit for 70 grand from a dealership, I should get good service. If I'm shopping locally and I'm paying $95,000 for that exact same unit, there's no way I'm going to be able to get 25 to 30 grand worth of additional service and support just because I paid that much more. If you know what I'm saying, it just doesn't make sense. That's what frustrates me about it. It's the financial burden that it puts on people who need to get out of their RV. I can understand that if you got a good deal on an RV, if you got it for that 20 to 35%, and I only say 20% only because there are, again, some units that don't have as great a margins as other units. Other units have huge margins. But let's just say, 20 to 35%. If you're not getting at least that off on the unit, then your depreciation is much, much worse on a unit that you're paying more than you should be paying for. And that's the thing that I think needs to change about the RV industry. I really think that they need to focus on making pricing right size, making the correct pricing. That way, one person doesn't have an identical unit as another person, but they're paying $700 or $800 more per month for that exact same unit. They're paying for it for a much longer period of time, and they'll never be able to get out of it simply because the depreciation on the unit is so much worse than this other person who at least got a fair deal on it, who's probably still going to get hit with a ton of depreciation. Anyways, guys, I just wanted to make that point. It's a rant of mine. If you're shopping for an RV, you absolutely need to shop around. You need to understand that the cost difference in the RV between one dealership and another is generally just profit. But you know what? If there is a dealership that you want to support and you do think paying them more is worth the service you're going to get, then that's a decision you have to make for yourself. And I'm not going to tell you you're wrong for making that decision, but you do need to understand that decision. Oftentimes it comes down to how good of a researcher you are and how good you are at negotiating. And unfortunately, some people aren't good at either. And if you're not good at either, you're likely to find yourself in a really bad situation. If you go out RV shopping, especially if you fall in love with one at the first dealership you go to, and you end up buying it without understanding how much that unit might cost at another dealership. And again, I'm not saying don't buy local. If you find an RV that you fall in love with locally, see what it's selling for at other dealerships, and then go back to your local dealership and say, this is what I'm willing to pay. I think it's fair. I'm even willing to pay you a little bit more, understanding that it may cost more for them to bring it down. The freight cost is going to be more, of course, if the dealership is further away from the manufacturer that they bought it from, all of that factored in. But that also goes into the convenience side of it, right? If you're buying it locally, and if you have to pay an extra $1,000 or $2,000 more at your local dealership to avoid having to drive, 10 hours to pick up an RV, it might be worth it. In my opinion, it would totally be worth it. But I'm not going to pay an extra $15,000 to $20,000 more just because they tell me that I'm going to get better service buying it from them. That to me is outrageous. Anyways, guys, I sure hope you enjoyed this video. I sure hope you got something out of it. I'd love for you to leave a comment below and let me know what you think about this topic, because it's a touchy one. I hate that it's just kind of this boring rant that I'm going on, but I think if you're shopping for an RV, it's probably helpful. The key here, do your research, shop around, know what other dealerships are asking for that unit, and make sure that if you're buying from any dealership, you're trying to get the best possible price you can, because anything you pay above that is just going to end up being profit for them and debt for you. Anyways, guys, if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and I'll talk to you again very soon.